Now we're moving into part 2. It is the 28th of June, 2010.
Thank you again, GeorgeAnne, for your service to the body of Christ and to people who are hungry to know where we are in this very critical period of history. It's just leading up to the very final events that I believe is going to bring our Lord back. But as we were discussing before the close of the first session, Preston was talking about scientifically they're creating these chimera, and you were talking about how you can mix animal DNA with human DNA and create these bizarre entities. By the way, we know in the book of Enoch they were doing it back then as well. Just a little sidebar, when God told Joshua to kill every man, woman, child, and beast, why kill the beast? Because of bestiality. But there may be something more going on there, but I don't want to get sidetracked on that. But the point is that it is like you said, Preston, what man is doing in terms of science. Now let's just ramp that up to the level of what the fallen angels did in Genesis 6. And now the reports I'm getting, Preston, that instead of the B'niha Elohim being the exclusive entities involved in producing Nephilim hybrids in Genesis 6, that Satan himself is involved in producing offspring in this generation. That means this is a whole new ballgame. And the point is that if man can do this at this level of science, it would be completely naive to think that Satan himself and the hosts of darkness do not have the same technological capacity.
Yes, the vast majority of women with D.I.D, that is highly complex, talk about an official ritual in which Lucifer and in the Illuminati and other groups, they differentiate between Satanism and Luciferianism. Lucifer means the bright one. They talk about a ritual in which there is a marriage between this child female that's a human and Lucifer, and unfortunately they have a sexual act. It is horrific, but anybody who studies extensively for any length of time D.I.D, they'll know that this is a reality and this is commonplace all over the world now. Wouldn't you agree with that, Doug?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, what I'm seeing now, and I'll just give you just a little brief scenario, what we've now learned through God revealing, to interfacing with the person's neshama, that there is a very carefully planned conception. That is, when I'm talking about those that have been selected to become Nephilim mothers, they have to be prepared genetically in order to conceive. And so, right at conception, when they are conceived, the context of this is there's a conception ritual on Mount Hermon. That portal was opened, that was opened in Genesis 6. It was reopened as a result of the Holocaust. The slaughter of 6 million Jews was enough to reopen that portal so that this conception ritual that takes place on Mount Hermon, what happens, it's like an invisible, but it's an overlay in the DNA. It's like a third strand. You have the double helix, but then you have another spiritual interface there, like a triple helix. And it's actually structured in. You cannot see it, but it's there, and it's installed as a result of this highly orchestrated ritual at the conception. Then that person at birth is taken to Jerusalem. It's anchored there on the Temple Mount. I won't go into that. We've talked about that in other broadcasts. Then that person is nurtured, and they go through various rituals throughout their life. There's death rituals. They're resuscitated. And during the constant structuring, restructuring, the application of the Hegelian dialectic, where they are split and conflicted and brought back into a synthesis, and constantly doing this over and over again, so that by the age 13, they're in a place where they can actually conceive and give birth to the Nephilim entity. And then at age 26, they have another part that becomes the wife that marries the entity. So we have all this that's been going on, to my knowledge, The earliest Nephilim mother that I know of was born in 1949. Her first Nephilim son that I'm aware of was born somewhere between 1962 and 63. There's a whole other thing in which I've already discussed in terms of the non-bloodline capacity to produce Nephilim as it was in the days of Noah. In my work, that capacity was reached in the year 2002. So where we are in history is very unique, and it's the end game. Just think about this, Preston. We know that the angels that sinned in Genesis 6, in 2 Peter 2:4, and Jude 6, they were put into prison. And that prison house is called Tartarus. That's where the type
Tartarus.
That's taken right from Enoch. So they were put there. Well, we know that all fallen angels weren't put there. So this is a specific group. So to me, it's a no-brainer that Genesis 6 is referring to fallen angels cohabiting with women. Otherwise, how do you explain a specific group of angels being put in prison in 2 Peter 2:4 and Jude 6? Otherwise, you have theologians who will look at those passages and they refer that to the fall of Satan. That's totally ridiculous. He's the prince of the power of the air. He still has access to mankind. He's in the second heaven and the first heavens, and he has access to mankind on earth. So we know from the New Testament commentary that these beings that sinned in Genesis 6 were judged and imprisoned by God. But here's the amazing thing, and I don't hear anybody talking about this. I hear them talk about back engineering and transgenics, and I just listened to a phenomenal interview with Steve Quayle and Tom Horn, and they're talking all around what we're talking about. And it's all important. I mean, it was a phenomenal interview, but nobody's talking about the fact that Satan himself and other fallen angels are cohabiting with women in our generation and producing Nephilim now. Nobody's coming out and saying it. Well, I'm coming out and saying it. I'm saying it is going on now, and it's pervasive. I talked with one woman the other day. She said there are thousands of these Nephilim entities, and they're integrated into the social structure. These are not giants. These are like Homo noeticus. This is the quintessential. They look like human beings, but they're not. And so I'm saying that not only is the church asleep, but even some of the people that are actually talking about this are not in the very area we're talking about right now. So here's the point. If those angels were judged and put into Tartarus in Genesis 6, and now the report, for the first time in history, in my estimation, this didn't happen until the birth of Israel. The birth of Israel was the trigger point historically. From the birth of Israel to the present, that Satan himself has been functioning as the Watchers did in Genesis 6. And you know what that tells us? Satan knows what happened. So it's all or nothing with him. Either he wins or he loses. It's the final showdown. And I think when we begin to think in those terms, that when we get to Revelation 19:19, when the armies of Armageddon are there to thwart, and as Russ Dizdar said, in their third attempt to kill God, the enemy is very serious. Either he wins or he loses. And the point is, Preston, he knows this. He knows this. He understands the end game.
Yes, but when people do something in psychology, I say, why do you do it, or what is the purpose? I think it would help Christians understand this very spiritually, theologically, and biblical issue here in these last days of what is the purpose. And of course, you use the Latin word homo noeticus, which simply means the new type of man, the new type of human. And there's a specific purpose for this. Now, I would like to add that in my experience, it's not just fallen angels just chaotically impregnating women. In my experience, it's the highest ranking fallen angels who do this.
I agree.
Because they want to create the highest form of a person, and they infuse energy in a demonic type fashion into these hybrids, these Nephilim that are born. These are energized so that they can be a superior race. It is something similar to dogs who are bred. They're bred for a specific purpose. Anybody who's an expert in breeding dogs knows that you can breed certain types of dogs to get a desired purpose. The desired purpose for this hybrid, this nephilim, is to create a warrior race that will be the soldiers for the Fourth Reich.
Yes.
And what do you think about that, Doug?
Absolutely. Yes, in Russ Dizdar's book, The Black Awakening, he talks about the creation of super soldiers, but in that book, he is referring to those who are programmed D.I.D people who, at a particular point in history, will be triggered to carry out assignments to break down the infrastructure and to create martial law. But these are all human. What we're talking about now is another level. And as I was listening to Tom Horn and Steve Quayle talk in their talk, what they call transhumanism, they're talking about a whole nother level of singularity, where we move from this phase of mankind to the Automan, those that are synthetic. And so we have all of that element. And I don't even want to get into that because they've already talked about it. And it's very important. It's an absolutely tremendous show. I want to stay focused on the fact that what we're talking about is the direct conception of a fallen angel. You said, Preston, the highest fallen angel, including Satan, with women, producing a specific kind of offspring that's different than Genesis 6.
Yes, and the people who are programmed to help bring in the Antichrist is something different than the Nephilim, as Doug, that you mentioned. So that's to be differentiated.
Well, in terms of a biblical category, I think we could refer them as like Nephilim, but they're different in this way. They're not necessarily giants. In other words, when Antichrist comes on the scene, he will be the quintessential of that which will be what the New Ages refer to as the evolutionary process of mankind attaining the status of an ascended master or becoming a bodiless entity. What I'm talking about is that the goal for this generation, Satan has to produce, like you were talking about, a special type of creation that will result in the birth of the false prophet and the Antichrist. Well, to get there, I believe that he has many redundancies. There have been mutations, and some of these mutations probably appear as what has been reported as reptilian. Some of these mutations appear as what has been reported as grays. Well, they can be used to fly the highly advanced Fourth Reich anti-gravity machines. But the goal, as you so well stated, is to create an offspring that would ultimately qualify to be Antichrist himself. Because Antichrist, when he appears, they will say, who is like him? We see in Revelation 13, when the false prophet directs mankind to make an image of Antichrist. Think about it. Antichrist will be the quintessential of that which would represent the whole evolutionary process of mankind according to New Age thinking. If man can make an image of Antichrist, what does that say? Man is now like God. You shall be like God. See, we finally attained God status because we could actually create, and then the process breathes life into that entity and it comes life. The image of the beast is a clone of Antichrist. But now you move all that forward, and here's the thing that no one has ever addressed. When Jesus Christ returns at the second advent, Revelation 20, verse 20, the false prophet and the Antichrist or the beast are seized and they're thrown alive into the lake of fire. Now, if we understand the doctrine of the resurrection and the judgment of the lost, there are two resurrections, the resurrection of the just and the resurrection of the unjust. When you go through scriptures, it's very clear, that all unbelieving mankind will someday stand before the great white throne judgment and be judged for their works and ultimately for their denying of Jesus Christ. But isn't it interesting that the beast and the false prophet are thrown alive in the lake of fire and they don't even appear before the great white throne judgment? And then Satan at the end of the millennial reign of Christ, he's thrown in the lake of fire. He doesn't appear there either. So why are they thrown in the lake of fire? I believe because they fit into the same category of species that were judged in Genesis 6. They have a physical form, but they do not have a human soul. So I just wanted to throw that out so people could be thinking about that, and you can just pick it up and go wherever you want, Preston.
Yes, I call that a type of the Trinity of Satan, the beast, the false prophet, and the dragon. This may sound crazy, some of the things that we have said, but secular scientists are talking now about the evolution of man so that he will be transhuman. And every year there is an international transhumanism conference. And transhumanism is the evolution and the improvement of man through genetics. And let me remind everyone that Joseph Mengele was a physician and his specialty was genetics. Joseph Mengele studied under one of the experts in the world on genetics, Dr. Ottman Freiherr von Verscher, who was the leading scientist in the world at the time in genetics. Transhumanism is the evolution or the improvement of man through genetics, robotics, artificial intelligence, or technology. And all of this put together in simple language is simply a duplication of what Nimrod tried to do at the Tower of Babel. Nimrod was so arrogant, he thought he could defeat God through special knowledge and through technology. So he built the Tower of Babel, which, by the way, is still in existence today in Iraq, the remnants of it. And he thought that building the Tower of Babel with technology and special knowledge, he could defeat God. Now we know that's foolish, but this is what Satan is going to do in the last days. He thinks he's going to defeat God through these homo noeticus, this new type of man, this transhuman, this parahuman, which will have an army together to destroy mankind and defeat God. And
yes.
This is what all of this is about.
Well, let's go back and let's now take what you just said, what I just said prior to this, and we're going to bring this back into the context of D.I.D. We know, in terms of the symptoms of traumatology, or study of traumatology, that the pathognomonic, that is the chief characteristic feature of chronic trauma, will be amnesia. In contrast, or contradistinction to an acute trauma would be like, where were you, Preston, when President Kennedy was killed? You know, don't you?
Yes, I remember. I was in the 5th grade in class sitting on the 3rd row.
There you go. I remember I was in my bed. I skipped school that day, and my grandmother came in, and she said, the president's been shot. It's just 3D. That's like, it's not a physical trauma, but it's acute trauma, and that's something you don't forget. But in contrast, chronic trauma in early childhood is just the opposite. The chief characteristic feature, or it's referred to as pathognomonic, is amnesia. The greater the trauma, the greater the amnesia. Now, if we think about people like Joseph Mengele, who is a programmer, they understood the inflammation of trauma and its psychological responses. So if you want to put programming into a people to carry out a particular role or hide secrets, let's say if you're going to traumatize a person, you're going to create all kinds of layers of abuse. And then as that abuse is repeated over and over again, the internal D.I.D. structure is layered. For example, the European bloodlines that have come to this country, they have layers on top of it. They were placed into surrogate families, which are dysfunctional, a lot of abuse, with the design that if they ever went to therapy, they'd never get past their surrogate family. And then behind that is the true European family. But deeper than that, you go all the way down to all the various psychological defenses. The deepest and the most hidden in the people I've worked with that are women is this Nephilim project, or what one girl has called the Genesis project. Now, isn't that interesting? If they understand trauma and how to layer it, why would they bury in the person's D.I.D. structure at the deepest level the event of a conception and giving birth to a Nephilim? In other words, SRA, D.I.D., as we call it, is just a framework where they can hide their investment so that they can carry out this end-time plan, and the people that are involved don't even know it because of the amnesia. So you can pick up on that any way you wish.
Yes. What happens is we'll just refer to them generically as people in the New World Order. That way we don't have to debate the different names of the groups. The New World Order is different groups preparing to bring in the antichrist and come into power in the world, a one world government, etc., which most Christians know about. For a person to develop dissociative identity disorder, they have to be traumatized or abused before the age of 7. You say, what happens if they're abused after the age of 7? After the age of 7, they develop post-traumatic stress disorder when they're traumatized or abused, just like 10% of the soldiers who come back from Iraq or Afghanistan. We all know about that. It has to be by design that these children are traumatized and abused before the age of 7. You kept referring to children that are traumatized. When a child is traumatized or abused, it is difficult for the conscious mind, and there's different types of memory. The child has a difficult time processing the information of the trauma or ritual abuse. So automatically, as a defense mechanism to help them survive, a wall of amnesia surrounds that memory. When that memory is triggered later on in life, and there are some exceptions, but usually when people are traumatized or abused as a child in an extreme fashion, the amnesic barriers are so great, those walls don't begin to deteriorate until about the age of 30. What happens is when a traumatic memory is triggered, it's like when Doug says, the memories are very specific. The brain interprets it as if they are actually there at the present moment. I have seen people develop physiological changes when a specific memory is triggered. Let me just give you some examples. I was counseling a man one day with D.I.D, and when he switched into this specific personality, his wife was sitting next to him, and she said, his eyes are hazel. And I said, yes, of course. I looked at his eyes. Yes, his eyes are hazel. She says, you don't understand. He doesn't have hazel eyes. He has brown eyes. So he pulled out his driver's license, and on his driver's license it says he has brown eyes. Studies have been done that there's actual physiological changes in the body. Prescription of glasses change. I have seen whelps appear on the forehead all of a sudden when a person's personality changes. So in their mind, it is just as if what happened 30, 40 years ago was occurring right at that moment. Some of the physiological changes are almost miraculous. Haven't you seen that many times, Doug?
Well, yes, and I think to comment on that, I think it was one of the articles I read is titled, The Body Keeps Score. It's a misnomer, but we all understand that work in this field when we refer to body memories. So when I'm working with a person, I watch their body, I watch what they're going through, and I see various changes that would indicate an unresolved traumatic dissociative state. I'm able to help them access that and get in there and retrieve the trauma. But here's the amazing thing. This is addressing the idea, well, this is just visionary. These people are reporting abuse. It's a false memory or it's a vision. What people don't understand when it comes to what you just described is that a traumatic memory, when it's brought forward, it's in 3D. If there's a smell, they smell. If there's a clock on the wall, you can ask them what time is it. They'll tell you it's 10:23. All the details of the room and the people are introjected during the trauma. And so when that's unpacked, it may be 30 or 40 years ago, but it's in 3D. Yes, there could be demonic distortion. There can be screen memories. But what people don't understand, if you don't have experience in this area, when a person is reclaiming their life from a traumatic past, a traumatic memory, and you know is stored in a different part of the brain, when it comes forward, it is far different than a malleable memory that is processed in whatever part of the brain. It's different. So when people talk about these people's history, how can you believe what they're telling us? One, they don't understand traumatic memory and how encoded it is. And two, they're disregarding these people as real witnesses. They're saying they're not really witnesses. And I think that's part of the denial that's in our culture. And I think denial is a satanically driven phenomenon. It's not only a psychological phenomenon, but it's spiritually driven to cover up and to keep the church in darkness, to keep the church in ignorance, so Satan can continue on with his agenda undetected.
There is what is called a dissociative continuum. That means the different degrees of dissociation on a scale of 1 to 10. 10 is a highly complex D.I.D, which means it has a very complex structure inside. 1 on the dissociative scale is imaginary friends.
There's no trauma there, right?
Yeah, but there is stress. The reason people develop imaginary friends is because the pain they're living in as a child is so great that they cannot deal with it. So they escape into a dissociative realm. And then the next one is daydreaming. Now, what this means, though, is, it's like Doug said, it is three-dimensional. All of their 5 senses are involved. Now, let me just explain this a little bit further so you can understand. When you have an imaginary friend, the child sees the friend. They describe what he looks like. When you daydream because of the pain of the stress of the moment. So it's not just thinking that you're at the beach. You are dreaming as if you are at the beach. You feel the sand and the wind. Now, that is on the low end of the dissociative continuum. When people are traumatized, the 5 senses involved is so real, they can describe it in more detail than I can describe it. In fact, detailed studies have been done, and it's shown that most of the time, if a female goes in a room and describes specific objects in a room compared to a male, a female can remember more details. That is why the high cult prefers to use females over males, because the detail of their memory is far greater than males. And the degree of the trauma is the degree of the thickness of the wall of amnesia around the memory.
Yes. Yeah, that's very excellent. Have you ever gone to the library and read the Encyclopedia Man, Myth, and Magic?
Yes.
It's quite exhaustive. I remember going to the library and reading and studying in the Druidic religion, which is really the old Babylonian religion. That's what most of the cult of the New World Order is. It functions in that particular, that Celtic Druidic kind of mindset. But in the Druidic religion, they had 3 categories of their social structure. They had the farmers, they had the warriors, and they had the priests. And back in the time of Gaul, which was France and Germany, and the Julius Caesar, he outlawed the Druidic religion because of human sacrifice. But it's very interesting that in that kingdom of Gaul, which is now France and Germany, which is still a huge stronghold, when the priests were going through the various levels of initiation, when they were ready to be initiated as a priest, they would go to the Isle of Man in Great Britain for their final stages, and they'd come back. So it's very interesting that the UK was actually in a higher level of spiritual evil than Gaul at the time. But the point I'm making is that the secrets of their religion, they didn't keep records. So what they did is they used the women as the repositories of their secrets. So we know that through the rites of passage, through chronic trauma in the women would fragment, and they could keep the secrets in the women without the women knowing that they were repositories for the secrets. But they could access them through certain rituals and release the power, ritual sex, and all that kind of thing. And this would be a 20-year process. And I read this in Man, Myth, and Magic. Now, the point I'm making is that when God created man and woman, mainly his particular function is leadership. He's the head of the family. That doesn't make him superior, but it's the role. The wife is nurturer. She is complemented, but a co-heir of the grace of life. Peter says we're to grant her honor as a joint heir of the grace of life because she is the woman, or she is womanly. The Greek is kind of hard to translate there. She is the feminine. And what I've told people in the past when doing marriage counseling is that if you are harsh to your wife, it may take a whole day for her to get over that. And with a man, they're over with it in 5 minutes, you know. The woman being the weaker vessel doesn't mean she's inferior, but a part of the femininity of a woman is her vulnerability. And that should bring out the nobility and the desire of a man to protect. But the cult understands that a woman is more vulnerable and therefore fragments more. In the men that I've worked with and the women I've worked with, women have a far higher level of fragmentation than men. Now, men could be fragmented, but in terms of the level of fragmentation, it's my experience that women fragment more, and I believe that's because women are more vulnerable. I believe the cult understands this. The Druids understood this. So the higher the level of fragmentation, the more capacity to structure them and to enhance all the amnesic barriers so that they become a power base. A lot of us understand that when women are being taken around and they're brought before heads of state and they have sex rituals to transfer powers to the heads of state, this goes on all the time. The people that I'm talking about, Preston, that have these conception rituals on Mount Hermon, where the capacity has been engineered into them, if you will, overlaid or laminated by the powers of darkness, that they actually become a portal. Like the portal from the second heaven there on Mount Hermon, this portal is transferred to them. They're actually made a portal. So wherever they go, they don't even have to go to a ritual to get powered up because of their internal structuring. They are a weapons platform. So their very presence can be interfaced with the powers of darkness. And they can be like a weapons platform to launch all kinds of things into the church, all kinds of things into government. And on their placental level, they don't even know this. But the sophistication which this is being done, this may blow people's minds, but it's out there. It's happening. And this means that whatever's going to happen in the days ahead, as believers, we're going to have to make sure we're really walking with God, because I believe when God's countermove, as we approach the end and all these weapons are released, and they're already in the church today, hidden, and most pastors deny it or don't even acknowledge that they didn't exist. But we're going to have to be such a kind of people that when God moves and empowers people who are walking with God, then it's going to be quite an amazing time in the very near future, the way I see it, Preston.
Yes, I would agree. The person becomes a portal or a doorway to the kingdom of darkness. But let me say, people may not understand the word portal. He's using that as a spiritual term, but I like to use it as a scientific term. If you take what Doug has just said, and if you talk to quantum physicists, they understand exactly what he's talking about.
Dimensional physics.
Yes, it's dimensional physics. A doorway has been opened in what is called by Albert Einstein, and everybody should remember that. It is a space-time continuum, and it is like a wormhole in the space-time continuum through this person. It is like a black hole has opened up in their life that takes them to this. That's why they'll often talk about time travel in the midst of all of this.
Yes, and I think the adversary, who is a spiritual being, he operates, as we see in Ephesians 6, we wrestle not with flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, the cosmocrators, the world rulers of this present darkness. The spiritual, the pneumaticos, the spiritual forces in the heavenlies. Professor Harris at Dallas, 5 times in the book of Hebrews, the word epiranos is used. Epiranos is heaven. not heaven. They're heavenly realms. And Professor Harris said you could translate that spiritual dimensions. So we know in physics that we have at least 10 and perhaps 11 dimensions that can be calculated mathematically. We know that. So that's on the physical level. We don't know how many other dimensions that are above that are on the spiritual level, but that are interfaced because it's a hierarchy. God understands this. The angels know this. And the deeper a person is initiated into the occult, they understand this. We are dealing with an enemy that is supernatural. But you know what? As we talk about all this, I think some of the listeners are going to hear this. It's going to be a mind blower for them, Preston. But you know what I would say? Satan cannot create anything. He is a creature. But he has the capacity to do some very high-level evil stuff. And people like you and me that work in this, we know that. But what's most important for people to recognize, that no matter how big Satan sounds tonight, God is still infinitely greater. And Daniel 11 says, those who know their God will do exploits. The real key to all this, and I have no fear of the enemy, and I know you don't either, is that in facing all this, is that we should be fearless. I love what Russ Dizdar says in his book, The Black Awakening. These last days, as the Black Awakening occurs, is what the cult calls it. He uses the analogy of David facing Goliath. Are we going to be up there in the rocks, or are we going to go down in the valley and run towards Goliath and meet him in the name of the Lord? What kind of people are we going to be? Well, by the grace of God, if there are hybrids let loose in the Black Awakening, I've already determined that I'm not going to run. I'm going to walk out in the name of the Lord, and I'm going to watch the victory of Jesus Christ take these creatures down if they come to assault my family or if they're turned loose in any way in the Black Awakening. I'm not talking about the super soldiers that are programmed D.I.D. I mean, if there are hybrids that are let loose for any reason prior to the rapture, only God knows. I've already determined, and I already know that the victory is with the Lord.
Yes. Now, keep in mind that we're talking about all of this, but there is a cosmic hierarchy that exists in the demonic realm, in the realm of evil, in the kingdom of darkness. And these nephilim and the other things that we have mentioned are connected to this cosmic hierarchy. And Doug mentioned a portal. Let me just give you the definition of the word portal in the dictionary. It is a magical or technological doorway that connects two distant locations. So it's connecting Earth to the evil cosmic hierarchy. And the dictionary says magical. We would say as Christians, an evil spiritual doorway, and that is a portal. And in Ephesians chapter 4, for example, it says, be angry and sin not, or you will open the doorway to the devil. So there's certain doorways or portals that sin can open to the kingdom of darkness.
Or structured trauma can open.
Or structured trauma, yes, that's exactly correct.
Yeah. Well, you know, the ziggurat towers were just that. There weren't a high mountain to perform these rituals. They did build the temple towers, these ziggurats. At the top, there was a shrine. And Babylon, that's the Hebrew term, Babylon, actually, in its own language, means the gate of the gods. So by creating these temple towers, it was a way for man to ascend to that place where the ritual was, and so there could be a union between the God, or the heavens, and the earth, and therefore that was most likely the ziggurats were designed to create this opening or this portal.
Yes, now what I find interesting is in many of the most sophisticated people with SRA-DID, many of the scenarios going on inside that is extremely on a evil, spiritual, demonic level, there's often a movie that has truths connected to it. And we're living in a time when the most popular movie was Avatar.
Mm-hmm.
And here they can connect through this body. They can project an image outwardly. we're dealing with things that are very sophisticated and very evil, and these people are not just imitating what they see in the movies. We see these people before these movies even come out.
Yeah.
And some people say, well, this is just from their imagination. The details, when their traumatized memories are triggered, the details they give cannot be from a book or a movie because they use all five senses. When you read a book, you only use your sight. You don't use your smell, your touch, or anything else. There's different kinds of memories, and we're not naive. We know there's other types of memories, but it doesn't relate to this. This is not false memories. I train Christian counselors to make sure that they don't what's called leading the witness.
Yes.
So we don't lead the witnesses. We don't talk to the people about nephilim.
That's
they
right.
talk to us about nephilim.
There you go.
We don't talk to them about portals. They talk to us about portals.
Just a little side note. Those people are Nephilim mothers. They wish it was somebody else. They don't even want to talk about it.
Yes, and most of the people that I've counseled, their friends say, well, you just make up these memories. These traumatized people are insulted because they say, I would never imagine these horrible things in my worst nightmare.
But someone come on and say, well, Satan planted that thing there, so how do you even know it's real? They don't understand trauma and the fact that there's a part of the humanity that records events, and it's called neshama. I've never seen yet where neshama ever change. Once that level is accessed in a person and identified by a trained counselor, I've never yet seen any truth associated with neshama, and God bringing forth that, I've never seen it change. I've seen it dilate and fill out in more detail, but I've never seen it change.
Yes, we know about programming, and anybody who says that this is not real, all they have to do is go back in the Freedom of Information Act and find that our own government, time and time again, has admitted to doing mind programming. MK Ultra and other things is what the United States government has done. So we know this is very possible. And keep in mind that the U.S. military and other government agencies has admitted in the past to doing different kinds of programming. So this goes on through government agencies and through specific military institutions.
Yeah. I think people can say, well, Dr. Colin Ross, you listened to all these different anecdotal stories about MK Ultra and things like that, and his statement was, my purpose was not to deny their story or to affirm it, but just to help them get better. So he did all this independent research about the various anecdotal stories that he was hearing from his various clients, including ritual abuse, and he started doing independent research and was able to corroborate the themes that was coming forth collectively from all of his clients. And yet, if that's all visionary, it really didn't happen, well then that would be completely set aside by the fact that Dr. Colin Ross did all this independent research to confirm the anecdotal stories that these people were talking about in this counseling office. But isn't it interesting that if you move into an area like Genesis 6, and in the same way, these people at the deepest level of their D.I.D. systems are reporting, conceiving, and giving birth to these hybrids, isn't it interesting? Now suddenly, this is this visionary, or how can we really be sure they're sincere? This is what they see, but how do we know it's really real? It's just not a demonically generated phenomenon. Well, isn't that interesting that when it comes to Nephilim, why is this set apart as something so extraordinary in terms of a person recalling a part of their history versus anything else that comes out of their anecdotal history as a survivor?
Yes, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk has proven scientifically that there is a total difference between traumatic memory that is triggered and short-term memory. Traumatic memories are in the long-term memory of the brain. Short-term memory is in a totally different section of the brain. And Dr. Bessel-Van-de-Kolk has proven this in a CAT scan, talking to people who dissociate. They use a totally different section of the memory. This has already been proven. Some people say there's such thing as false memory. Actually, in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, there is no psychological condition known as false memory. That is a made-up term by the False Memory Association. It's just made up. There is no such thing as a false memory. People who believe in that just don't know what they're talking about.
That's right.
Do you agree with that, Doug?
Absolutely. Now, I know and understand how screen memories are used and how they're installed to hide the deeper, more strategic secrets. One of the things that I think it's important to address is that when I'm listening to an anecdotal story, and it's not like, well, a part comes out and says that Satan had sex with me and I produced nephilim. It doesn't work that way. Parts, they have functions. They don't really have a history. When you get into the real core of the person, where more of his spiritual identity is, this is where you get into the real history of where all this hybrid stuff is coming from. And when a person is going through the process of healing and integration, they'll often have a lot of conflict. What is true? What is real? One part will be in denial, say, no, this didn't happen. It happened to somebody else. If they're still in conflict, how do I know what's true? You know what I tell them? I said, just keep doing the work. When everything comes together, you'll know what you need to know. If someone in the past come out, how do I know this happened? That sounds bizarre. I mean, I gave birth to a nephilim. That's crazy. I said, don't worry about it. Let's just keep doing the work. I didn't sit there and try to tell them, read to them Genesis 6 or anything like that. I just kept working with them, working with the trauma, allowing the person's identity to consolidate and move into healing. And then when they are integrated, their history is their history. And the people that I'm talking about, Preston, and I'm focusing on this particular area of conception and birth of nephilim, they're giving this not as an altar or a part of their process. They're speaking to this out of the deepest core of their identity as people who are highly integrated. If people don't understand the whole process of coming out of dissociation into a life of integration, that may not mean much, but they're not in a place where they can stand back and say, well, this can't be, this is too bizarre. I would suggest to people that are in that category, you should humble yourself, and there are people that actually know more about this, that are experienced, like yourself, and to just take a humble attitude. I don't fully understand all this, but if Genesis 6 happened then, and Jesus says, as it was in the days of Noah, so will be the return of the Son of Man, and the beast and the false prophet are thrown alive in the lake of fire, and they don't stand before the great white throne judgment, what kind of category are they? Start connecting the dots. Start walking in humility and not judging something that this sounds like an X-Files program we're having here tonight.
That's right.
When you see a person abreacting and going through the trauma, when they go into these particular events where they're reconnecting with their past, the abreactions, the trauma is so horrific, it's the last thing in the world to think that this is something made up or visionary. The very symptoms of trauma and the abreactions themselves validate the fact that what is presenting and the trauma associated with it is real.
Yes, but there's an old saying, and it goes, truth is stranger than fiction. These things are so horrendous, it's obvious that it's just not made up at all. I know there's a lot of people who have trouble understanding this, but if you can listen to these people day in and day out, you'll know that these people are honest. They have enough problems in their life without making up problems. It's just a traumatic memory. Many famous people have dissociative identity disorder. They just don't want to publicize it. And the memories they have are legitimate. They just don't announce it on the news.
Yeah.
This stuff is not made up, and we don't lead witnesses. We don't put thoughts into their mind. We just listen and do our best with Jesus as the wonderful counselor to help them and minister to their needs.
Yeah. we come to the conclusion, like some of our friends who are saying, well, this is just visionary and it really didn't happen. And when people finally renounce that they really did give birth to a hybrid, they all get better. You know what? If our people have done this, they may have a temporary flight into hell. But if there's still any buried trauma, it's going to leak out later on in life. Something's going to trigger. And the real test with all of this is when a person is truly integrated, you see the fruit in their life. They're not triggered anymore, and they're not in denial. When people say, I have all these several hundred, that these women who deny that it ever really happened, I ever really gave birth to a hybrid, my concern is that how many of these people are dissociated? And this one individual wouldn't even know because he is not qualified to know. He's coming out of the alien abduction background. So with someone like yourself, if you take these 400 people who have finally denied that they ever conceived and give birth to nephilim, and we brought these who are now healed by Jesus. If you brought these people into, say, to meet with you, there are tests to see if they're still dissociated. And you know what I find? This is a very interesting story, and I think you'll appreciate this, Preston. A number of years ago, I got a call from a young lady. I was living in Tulsa at the time. The girl's name was Lisa. She was a young woman. I never met her before. She went to the ward, the psych ward, or whatever you want to call it, the Ross Institute in Dallas, Texas. She was down there on Dr. Colin Ross's facility, and he personally worked with her. And I don't know what his ultimate assessment was, that somebody on the ward says, oh, you live in Tulsa? Well, there's a guy, Doug Riggs, up there. I mean, he knows about this stuff. So anyway, when she got out, she called me. She introduced herself to me, and I said, well, yeah, well, who are you? And she said, well, I just got off 5 weeks in the ward, and Dr. Colin Ross worked with me. And she says, I'm integrated. I said, well, that's great. I'm glad you were helped. And so I don't do this anymore, Preston, but I have tests to find out if people are integrated or not. And so I did my little thing, which I don't do anymore. She was manifesting all over the place. She even switched into parts that were manifesting demons. And this was on the phone, and she had just come back. And in her mind, she was integrated. And you know what? I believe she wanted to be integrated. And I think when people have gone through any kind of trauma, there's this kind of a sense of flight into hell. I want this over. But it's not over till it's over. And this is my concern. People, if they're given a reason to go into denial and they still have unresolved trauma, they can go off as if they've been healed by Jesus.
Yes, that's right. I've heard of people who went to this person and in 2 days they said they were healed. And of course they weren't. And a few weeks later they realized they weren't.
Yeah. I want to just read a section from Nephilim Stargates by Tom Horn, this paragraph here. Going back to the foundation of a lot of that which we are experiencing today, we both know that the New World Order on a global international level is really the Fourth Reich. It is the industrial complex, and those involved that escaped Germany, went to Argentina. Dr. Joseph Farrell has written on this, the Nazi International. He's just tremendous. But in Tom Horn's book on page 140 of Nephilim Stargate, he says this, quote, Hitler's aim was neither the founding of a race of supermen nor the conquest of the world. These were only means towards the realization of the great work he dreamed of. His real aim was to perform an act of creation, a divine operation, the goal of a biological mutation which would result in an unprecedented exaltation of the human race and the apparition of a new race of heroes and demigods and God-men. And then Tom concludes on that. Some believe that was Genesis 6 and could be again the whole idea. Well, what Tom said could be, we know is already happening. But I thought that was a tremendous quote. I want to quote one other section. This book was written by D.H. Pember, Earth's Earliest Ages. I think it was originally released in 1876. At the very end of his book, he has a closing section on the signs of the times. It's very, very excellent. He talks about the many antichrists and the warning of not to go out in the wilderness, and Christ is here and Christ is there. He's warning about some of the end time phenomenon leading up. Now remember, this book was released in 1876. And the little side note says this, reoccurrence of the characteristics of the days of Noah, union of the two worlds and preparation for the descent of the Nephilim. And so in concluding his 400-page book, he says, lastly, the characteristic features of the days of Noah are reappearing. And above all, free communication has been established between the spirits of the air and the human race with a view, apparently, to a sojourn once more of the nephilim upon the earth. So here is a man of this caliber who is speaking about this 135 years ago. He's way ahead of 99% of most pastors that I've heard in the pulpit today, Preston. And then he concludes this way. It thus appears that this long-expected event, that is, the final consummation of the age with the reappearance of the Nephilim, it appears that this long-expected event will precede Satan's banishment from heaven, Revelation 12, and therefore also its result, the revival of the Roman Empire and the revelation of the man of sin. Back then, there was no EU, and yet he knew from the Word of God it was going to happen. And he continued. The Church of Christ will be called away before earth is, for a time, abandoned to the Nephilim, before the fearful woes of the end. And then in the next paragraph, he says, therefore, in all probability, the Lord is at hand. And he continues, if then the fallen angels appear to be already preparing for their descent, if the great apostasy, which will at last evolve the lawless one, be even now spreading, who can be sure of a day or an hour? I think that comment by Dr. Pember is probably a good way to end this. But Preston, I want to thank you so much. I know this has been a long time, but do you have any other thoughts? Is there anything you'd like to just convey to our listeners?
Yes, I just think that the book he wrote in 1876 is amazing in how it applies today. I think most Christians can agree upon this, that we are living in the last days, that we need to be prepared more than the church is preparing them right now. Yes. And we need to pray and bind the forces of evil and release the blessings from God. And we need to be prepared for the coming battle. I'm afraid most Christians are not prepared. They want to be magically delivered from their problems. And the world is evil. The Bible teaches that. And this is a battle between good and evil, between Satan and God. And we're doing our part. Doug and I are doing our part to minister to these people who are extremely traumatized. The last thing we want to do is make up stuff for these people. We want to help them and minister to them in the name of Christ, and we want to build up the body of Christ. So Christians need to be prepared for these last days, and they need to claim their position in Christ, and greater is He that is in us, the Lord Jesus Christ, than he that is in the world.
Yes, amen. I totally agree. And Preston, you have written a book. Could you give us the title and maybe just a brief description of the book and why you wrote it?
Yes. I had so many people call me and talk with me about the attack of Satan in their life. I've been on numerous TV and radio programs, and it actually saves me time by just writing the book. So I wrote the book, A Spiritual Warfare, Defeating the Forces of Darkness. My website is spiritualwarfarecenter.com. I wrote it to help people know their spiritual resources in Christ that they can do on a daily basis, that every Christian needs to do, whether you're attacked by the devil or not.
Yes. And on the back of the book, is there a description of the contents?
Yes. It tells about the different degrees of attack by demons. People think that everybody just needs deliverance, and only for people that are in severe bondage. There's different types of demonic attacks. We need to use the right response from the Bible depending on the type of attack from the devil.
Yeah,
and that's
okay.
what my book tells about.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I know there's much more, but I think this is probably a good starter, and God willing, depending on what kind of response we get from this, we may need to have a follow-up. So we'll just trust the Lord for this. Blessings to you, my brother, and thank you to GeorgeAnne for making this time possible.
Thank you so much, Doug, and thank you so much, GeorgeAnne, for being a warrior for Christ and standing against the forces of evil and standing up in the Christian community for the truth.